Hey students, this is your Professor O. This is biomedical ethics during the COVID-19 crisis, and we're on day 21, and we're going to be examining the assertion embryos are not persons. All right, so before I get into that, I just wanted to draw your attention to the Canvas page to say that case study 4 is due therapeutic misconception. Right, so these two lectures that are posted there will be relevant for you handling that case. All right, let's talk about today's topic. Embryos are not persons. All right, so the reason I picked this topic is because the personhood issue with respect to embryos, human embryos, is kind of a center of gravity issue. Right, it relates to a lot of different topics. All right, so obviously it's going to relate to the abortion issue. Now I realize there are arguments that say that abortion is okay even if the fetus is a person. But if you are not convinced by those and you are in favor of abortion, then this is going to be something you're going to contend for, that they're just not persons. And if fetuses aren't persons, then certainly embryos are not either. And that is not going to pose any sort of problem for like IVF treatment, in vitro fertilization, where you create many leftover embryos that are just not used, that don't get implanted. That's not going to be a problem. All right. Other issues like stem cell research. Right. This was a big one, and obviously today's reading is very much about that. All right. And so I wanted to go over the background of stem cell research because it is so complicated, and it's also very interesting. Now, it got probably the most press of any bioethical issue since the abortion debate. And this was during the 2000s when Bush was president. And most of the discussions were about the moral status of the embryo and whether or not it makes claims on us in our scientific research. All right, so I want to start by kind of going back a bit. Okay, so this issue doesn't start in 1994. It actually grows out of earlier research that got really interested in the things that were coming out of the womb in the case of like a miscarriage or the umbilical cords or this kind of stuff, and the remains of fetuses who had died during childbirth became of interest to researchers. And as you can imagine, that coincided with issues over abortion and whether or not you could use and derive cell lines from aborted fetuses. And so that became a huge ethically fraught topic, as you can imagine. If you'll remember the Planned Parenthood expose videos from a few years ago, retouched in this issue in ways that were disturbing to many people, right? And also polarizing. But 1994 is an interesting year because in light of all of that background, the NIH got interested in research on embryos. It's like, all right, let's leave maybe the fetus thing alone. That's too controversial. Let's look at embryos and see if we can't derive the things that we want from those, right? They don't take on a human-looking form, right? They're not on their way to developing into a human being, at least. They just, they can be created in a petri dish. And so let's use those. Well, there was public outcry over that, right? And Bill Clinton, of all people, actually had this to say about the recommendations that he was given here by his NIH people. I do not believe that federal funds should be used to support the creation of embryos for research purposes. And I've directed that the NIH not allocate any resources for such research. All right, so that is pretty interesting, isn't it? This comes from a Democrat, right? He is a pro-choice Democrat. Okay, so he is not somebody that you would expect to say something like that. And he did not adopt the recommendation of this NIH document, which you can read here. It's for your information. All this stuff is on like Georgetown's website. It's pretty amazing. So I linked to that for your information if you find this interesting. Okay, so that's 1994. As this issue, though, is still very much part of the public consciousness, Congress passes what's called the Dickey-Wicker Amendment, right? And so there's a link about that here on this interesting website. It's like the Embryo Encyclopedia, right? And so what's interesting about this is this says, this is a congressional standard now, this is law, the creation of a human embryo or embryos for research purposes, or research in which a human embryo or embryos are destroyed, discarded, or knowingly subjected to risk of injury, death, and so on and so forth. Okay, you get the idea. Will not be funded. No funds will be made available. Okay? All right, so what you have to understand here is that there's just no funding being allocated. There's not a law being passed against this, right? At this time, you could research these things, right? You could destroy the embryos in your research if you were privately funded, okay? But not a lot of people were really doing that until 1999. Some researchers reported in Science, the Science Journal, that embryonic stem cells, or ES cells, as I will call them, could be derived. You could get stem cells out of embryos. And so the NIH, taking an interest in this, drafted guidelines to fund embryonic stem cell research on embryos that could be cloned, right? That was one thing you could do. You could use cloning. It's called therapeutic cloning. It's different from reproductive cloning, where you're cloning like your child. Like, that's not what you're doing. You're cloning the embryo in order to research on it. So you could get those, and also you could also get leftover embryos from IVF clinics, right, that weren't using them. Okay, so all this was thought to be compatible with this amendment. Okay, that was the idea. This was thought to be compatible, especially these, right, especially from the IVF clinic, because those were just thought, they're just not going anywhere. They're going to die anyway, and so why not use them? There was also some thought that cloned embryos were not real human embryos. They were somehow like downgraded to just pure tools of scientific researchers, biological artifacts, what they called them. Anyway, that's sort of the argument that they gave in these guidelines. Right, you can check it out. And then, so this is 1999, right? Bush is elected in 2000, and then in the first year of his presidency, this becomes like the big issue. This is all before 9/11 and the Iraq War. And Bush decided that he was going to allow funding for embryonic stem cell research that were on cell lines that were already derived from human embryos in the past. Right, so there are a couple cell lines lying around. The embryos from which they came were already destroyed. And so Bush thought, well, we can give money for those. And he did, right? Money was actually given for that kind of research. But he did forbid funding on the creation of new cell lines, right? So he didn't want to have any more embryos destroyed for the sake of developing a new cell line. And the reason why is that he cited the moral status of the embryo, right? He thought that to do this kind of research that involved their destructions was a form of taking human life. And so he thought that was also incompatible with this amendment up here, all right? Bush, of course, was deeply influenced by the President's Council on Bioethics, all right? And the person who was running that at the time was Leon Cass. If you remember, we read some of his work. And Cass, I don't want to print this. It's a wrong button. I was going to zoom in here. Cass thought that destroying embryos for research was immoral. He also thought that cloning was totally immoral, right? So there's a ton of information here. If you want to get into all this stuff, oh, my daughter is waking me up. I have to stop talking for a second. All right, sorry, I'm back here. That was my 5-year-old. She said, "Daddy, you keep waking me up. I'm doing this at like 8 o'clock at night and it's past bedtime." Anyway, sorry about that. Okay, so where were we? Here we are. Okay, so we are on the President's Council of Bioethics, and they convince Bush that this is immoral. Okay, and Bush holds the line. Okay, in 2006, when Bush lost Congress to the Democrats, and also too, he had some. Oh, what do I say? There was some bipartisan support actually. So I don't remember if he lost Congress or not. Maybe you shouldn't quote me on that. Anyway, it doesn't matter. He ended up vetoing some legislation that was brought before him, right, to legally fund embryonic stem cell research. Okay, and one of the things he did is he brought children to the veto, right, that were adopted as spare embryos, right? They were there. And so he said, "This is why I'm not doing it." So you can kind of see how that was kind of quite a powerful image for him, right? He really felt that there was a connection to these children, to the embryo, that was morally important. Okay. 2007, the journal Cell reports that stem cells are derivable without the need to destroy an embryo. Okay, and so you can read this paper here. It's kind of a game changer. I don't really fully understand all the science involved with it. That's not my job. The thing that I want to say about it, though, is that it alleviated the problem in a lot of ways. It did. It alleviated the problem. A lot of researchers that were lobbying for embryonic lines switched to these. But it didn't fully solve it, right? They did find some problems with this particular method. And so in 2009, Obama revoked Bush's policy by way of executive order, and he allowed research to go forward on embryos from IVF clinics. All right? So that is the background. That's the history, right? It was very, very, very controversial, politically charged stuff. All right? It is... You know, it was so emotional in some ways because you would hear politicians say that Bush didn't care about people, that he just wanted them to die. You would see all these ads about investment companies would be running about people who were confined to wheelchairs because they were paralyzed walking again, right? Because this was thought to be very, and it still is thought to be very promising for what's called regenerative medicine. And beyond 2009 here, you know, you see some treatments being deployed for spinal cord injuries, blindness, you know, some of the other things here. I don't know what else is going on. At any rate, there's all kinds of stuff in the works, right? You can read about that through that link. And so it was just incredibly fraught, right? And the embryo issue has come up recently too, in the use of contraception that keeps like an embryo from implanting. That's like one of the methods anyway that people are worried about, that came up in the Hobby Lobby cases not too long ago. And so this is a big issue, okay? I should also just point you to this New Atlantis volume. Now this is from a conservative publication, and the people who wrote it are conservative. However, they do give a very thorough overview of the whole situation, right? So if you really want to know, like, what are the promises of stem cell therapies? I mean, they have a whole document about that, right? You can get into all this, you know, it can cure autoimmune diseases and neurological disorders, all kinds of things, right? So I recommend that to you because if you really want to do a deep dive, you know, even though you might find it conservative, it's still really good. Lots of good information here, okay? Okay, so one question I just wanted to ask here is this, is what do you think of this history, right? Is there anything surprising here? What sticks out to you? How did you feel about this issue? Going into it, what are the things? Did Bush make the right call? I mean, one of the things that he was trying to do here was push researchers to find alternative ways in getting stem cells so that they wouldn't be destroying embryos. Did he make the right call? Or should he have just done what Obama done right away? Okay, that's one thing we're going to want you to think about. All right, so let's get into Mike Sandel here and his argument. All right, Michael Sandel is a very, very popular professor at Harvard University. He's a very popular public intellectual. This is one of his classes, right? You can see here, he's just one of the most popular professors like in Harvard's history. It's just incredible. He's a Socratic teacher, and he is very good at asking the right questions and communicating to the public, especially about very, very complicated, high-level and abstract ideas in a way that is down to earth, accessible, clear, and compelling, right? He's a very, very good public intellectual, all right? And he was also on Bush's President's Council of Bioethics, okay? So he was there with Leon Kass and the other people who advised Bush to prohibit funding, okay? To prohibit funding. And he argued against them all, okay? And so this paper that I had you read is interesting because it's actually an appendix of a book called The Case Against Perfection. And this is a great book, especially for those of you who are interested in the ethics of genetic engineering and what we can do with just people's genomes and designer babies and all that kind of stuff. And he argues very much against that. Okay, you can also follow this link to the article that he wrote in the Atlantic. I've used up all my links to the Atlantic, so I can't link to it, but that's where it comes from. All right, so he's very much against like designer babies and genetic to enhance kind of ideas. He thinks genetic therapies for curing diseases is okay, but not like, I don't know, making your kid 6'5" or something like that, right? So in light of all that, in light of that conservative stance, right, he does say that he's in favor of embryonic stem cell research, right? And so he gives an argument for why, and here it is, okay? So the first premise that I'm not going to talk a whole lot about, okay? This was one big piece of the paper that you had to read, but I'll just kind of explain what's going on here. Right, premise one is saying the moral arguments for research cloning and for stem cell research on leftover embryos stand and fall together. Okay, so some people think that you can't do this. Okay, cloning's just bad and icky, but you can do this. All right, but you can do this, and he just doesn't think that's going to work. Okay, because the question about like embryos that are created in IVF treatments is assuming that you can just create these things for your purposes, for whatever purpose you have, right? He just thinks, hey, that's the moral question. Can you do that? Can you just create embryos for some instrumental purpose? All right, and so he is going to say that we got to solve that question first. And so if you can do one, then you can do the other. All right, if you can do one, then you can do the other. Okay. Now these arguments are going to fall together only if either the embryo has moral status, okay, the same one as a human person, or if you were to permit these practices, right, then they would lead to dehumanizing practices, right? And he lists a couple here. He talks about, cloned babies, embryo farms, use of fetuses for spare parts, commodification of human life. Right? So that's what he thinks is going to make these arguments fall apart. Now, premise 3 says the embryo does not have the moral status of a human person, and we can avoid slippery slope dehumanization by good regulations. All right? So therefore, the arguments for both practices stand, and that means that then research on embryos is fine. Okay? So I want to really look at this premise here, especially this premise. Okay, that's what I'm going to be looking at. Okay, that part of the premise. So let's get into that, okay? Let's get into the claims about that. Let's say this, all right? He thinks that the belief that embryos are persons entitled to protections against killing does not depend on any religious belief. And that's a little surprising, isn't it? Most of the time, especially in the public realm, when we think of people that, believe that embryos are equal in worth as like, a human child or a human adult, we think, well, that's just gotta be religious, right? And you could appeal to like some biblical theology about how God is creating you in the womb, and he's got a whole plan for you, and he loves you, and this is where you get your moral status from. You're made in God's image, right? And this sort of belief is going to be widespread, not just in like Christianity, but also in like some Jewish theology or Islamic theology. And Sandel wants to set all of that aside and say, look, you actually don't need to appeal to any religious premise at all to get this argument off the ground. You could appeal to a Kantian argument. Now, if you remember what Kant said in our unit on autonomy, he was a big defender of this idea called the categorical imperative. And in that particular moral structure, we are to act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. And then the thing that's interesting here that he goes on to say, or at least the way the argument's supposed to go, is that embryos share in this humanity, right? They share in this humanity that's morally important, okay? And there's just no point, right, where they suddenly gain this after they come to be. Again, this is how the argument is going, right? The Kantian argument, right? Try to find a point where where embryos gain humanity, okay? You're not going to find one, and they are human from conception. So then to create them in order to harvest their stem cells, right, is to treat them as a mere means, okay? And so therefore we ought not do such a thing, okay? That's the Kantian argument. Sandel says that this reasoning is flawed. This idea that embryos share in our humanity is ambiguous, okay? So on the one hand, there's a species sense in which that's true. Certainly they share in our humanity insofar as they are members of the species Homo sapiens. Okay, but he thinks that there's a more personal sense here that is missing. Okay, embryos do not share in that. Okay, they do not share in that. An analogy he draws upon to reinforce the point, he says, look, right, there are acorns in the world, but no acorns in oak tree, even though every oak tree was once an acorn. All right, so look, I mean, and this is fairly obvious. I mean, I remember I was down at University of South Carolina walking around in the Horseshoe. There's lots of oak trees. They're enormous, like 200 years old. And an acorn fell on my head, right? And I cursed it, right? It really hurt. But of course, right, that was so much better than having one of those oak trees fall on me, right? There's a big difference, okay? And so to say that an oak tree fell on me when I'm talking about an acorn is just totally misleading, right? He also says that the personal sense of human life develops by degrees, okay? At some point, the nascent human species member achieves personhood, right? So I want you to focus on that personhood is achieved, and it's through some kind of process of development. We've passed through some phase where we then become to enjoy the moral status of personhood. Personhood is not endowed from birth, right? So this distinction between achievement and endowment is going to be important going forward, right? So this is an achievement view of personhood. Now, some people object, right, that because there is no discrete time when this occurs, right, we can't point to one, then we got to move all the way back to conception, which is really the only time we can think of that's discrete, where we can say that, that's when the embryo becomes a person. And Sandel just goes, well, just because there is no discrete time, that's not going to show that embryos are persons, right? So he kind of turns the tables on this argument, right? It's like, just because there's no discrete time that shows, that tells us when somebody becomes a person, when somebody achieves it, you can't say, right, that the embryo itself is a person from the beginning. Okay, so he uses a couple other examples to show this is the case, right? That we cannot know when a heap of sand becomes a heap, right? So you have this idea, you keep adding grains of sand to a pile. Well, when does it become a big heap? I mean, it's impossible to know that, okay? It's also impossible to know, like, when somebody goes bald, how many hairs do you have to lose until you're bald, okay? Just because we don't know the points, like when this transition happens, it just does not establish, right, that a grain of sand is also a heap in some sense, or that there's no difference between bald and not bald. There is. And so even though, right, it's just closed off from our knowledge when this transition occurs, that doesn't mean that there hasn't been a transition. That's important. And he thinks this is true of personhood as well. All right, so if this is true, okay, the question I want you to think about is this. What is the feature, or features as the case may be, that makes one a person? Okay, Sandel seems to think that newborns and late-term fetuses have some sort of moral status. Okay, it would be totally wrong to kill them for research purposes. So what's the feature? What's doing the work? Okay, and I want to guard against the answer, oh, well, they're sentient. That actually isn't good enough, okay? Because sentience does nothing for lab rats. Now, there is an argument about this, right? Peter Singer is famous for saying this kind of thing, that sentience is enough and we shouldn't be experimenting on animals. All right. But if we're kind of taking the biomedical research framework, as it's been delivered to us in the law these days, it is just uncontroversial to use rats for research. But they're sentient, all right. So what is it then that makes somebody a person? Okay, what is it that makes somebody a person? Sentience also isn't going to make somebody a person either, right? Even if you think that animals have moral status and shouldn't be killed for research purposes, they're still not persons. All right, so it's just like a metaphysical question here I'm raising. Like, think about it a bit. The other argument he gives is that he thinks the implications of the equal personhood view, right? So if you think that embryos are persons, right, this is going to create trouble for you. It's going to contradict your behavior and other moral intuitions that we have about the real moral status of embryos. Okay, so here's the case of the 5 embryos or 5-year-old girl choice. Okay, so the argument's quite simple here. You have an opportunity to rescue either 5 embryos or a 5-year-old girl from a burning building. You can only choose one to save. Which would you choose? Right, and it's really hard to believe that you would choose, or that you should choose, the 5 embryos. Okay, it's really hard to believe that. Just about anybody who takes any time to think about this question opts for the 5-year-old girl, even those who think that embryos are persons. So what's the deal? Okay. IVF is totally immoral, okay? This is impracticable. This should be shut down tomorrow, right? Because it leaves hundreds of thousands of human beings abandoned in freezers, all right? But yet it's legal, and there's nobody calling for a ban for that. Now, consistent people who think that embryos are persons actually don't believe this is moral, and they agree with this. So this is a bullet that they don't think is really damaging to them, and they're quite willing to bite it, chew it, and swallow it. No problem. They think it's totally wrong. People shouldn't be doing this. So that's that. However, if you're going to go that way, then what about natural embryo loss? All right, so there's different statistics about this, but anywhere from like 50 to 75% of fertilized embryos, human embryos, after fertilization, don't make it. Right? They don't implant, and they don't survive. They die. Okay, and this issue, then, if it's really the case that they are equal in personhood with us, okay, that should be taken way more seriously. Okay, there should be some kind of approach to figuring this out. If there was like a 50% to 75% infant mortality rate, you would be all over that, trying to figure out how to lower that. Okay, but we don't do this at all. And so it just doesn't seem like this is a very credible view, because it doesn't inspire the right sort of action. Okay? All right, the last bit of his argument is that there's no binary of options for respect. Now, what I mean by that is that the debate so far is sort of dividing things into like persons, right? This is like the Kantian argument that Sandel is taking on, right? Dividing things up into persons and things. And things are just tools that you can use and dispense of them, okay? They have no value apart from their instrumental value, okay? And Sandel rejects that as a false dichotomy, right? He says that embryos do deserve some respect, okay? They are like physical objects that are works of art. They have a kind of intrinsic value or final value, right? Same thing, I taught environmental ethics, right? We talked a lot about this, right? Landscapes or trees. Sandel brings up the example of the sequoias, right? There's these majestic, beautiful trees, and we are incensed when we see somebody like carving their initials into them. Okay, we find that just to be absolutely bad behavior. Stop that right now. Okay, so anyway, he thinks that these things, right, embryos, should be accorded a degree of respect, right? Especially in ways that would restrict our use of them. So we would avoid the slippery slope worries, right? The commodification of human life, embryo farms, this kind of stuff. All right? So a question I want to pose to you, right? In light of that, sub-personal intrinsic value, okay? In light of that value, how do we pay respect to an embryo that we're allowed to manufacture and destroy for research purposes? How does one repay that respect, right? What kind of worth is this, right? I want you to think hard about that. Okay, so that is today's lecture. I hope, this wasn't too annoying with the interruptions here, but that is all I have to say about that, and I will talk to you later. Oh, and never mind, if you have a question in the discussion, please ask, right? I think it's really good. You guys have been doing really great in the discussion section of our Canvas page. All right, so please ask good questions. I really enjoy what you're saying, and I gotta find my, there we are, all right. Okay, this has gone on too long enough, right? I'll talk to you later.